Hello everyone. So now you know the 3 tasks you have to do in level 2 speaking and listening. This video will show you words and phrases that you can use in that discussion. So to begin with, it will show you criteria and then words to use. So the exam criteria and words to use. So this is the information that we're given to look at for how you manage in your discussion. Let's cover that part and begin with identify relevant information from extended explanations or presentations. What does that mean? Well, you don't need to worry about that. You need to show that you've listened to what somebody else has talked about, and then maybe you could say to them, you said, or if you're agreeing with what you heard, I see what you mean. And remember, you can then add, I see what you mean, and, or you can suggest something alternative. I see what you mean, but I agree with you. Again, you're adding an extra bit of information to what's already been spoken about. I agree with you, particularly when you talked about that makes sense, or I liked the bit about that really made sense. So what about if you've looked at identifying information, you've chosen perhaps 1 or 2 things you could use to respond to someone's presentation, and now you're thinking about, how do I follow the narratives and lines of argument? Well, all you need to look at is summarising perhaps. Just to summarise your point then about the electric cars you were talking about, or so if I follow you correctly, I prefer the first one, don't you? When you use the word summarise, it sounds a little bit more eloquent. But you could say, so if I follow you correctly, in other words, you're saying that. I love that phrase, in other words, because that definitely shows that you followed the line of argument because you're retelling it in a different way. Well, what about if you just needed to clarify what somebody had said there? Did you mean, so again, you followed the argument or the ideas, and now you're asking a question by rephrasing something they've said. Are you saying that? Again, you're clarifying. Just to clarify then, and when you repeat something that somebody has said, that's a clear indication to your examiner that you knew what they were talking about. And if you rephrase it, that's an even better way of showing. And you can do that by saying, just to clarify, so let me make sure I've got this right. And we do that in normal discussions, don't we? So you can say, you said, because we use this a lot when we're talking, you said this. Did this mean this? Oh, did you mean this? Let me sure I understood that. So what about acknowledging? Yes, I hear what you're saying about. I appreciate your viewpoint about, or I appreciate that viewpoint, I beg your pardon. I appreciate your viewpoint. Or if you're empathizing with the person who's just spoken. Well, it sounds like this is important to you, and I would add something to show that you'd followed the line of argument. It sounds like this is important to you, especially when you mentioned. Or that must be challenging for you. Or this part of what you said sounded really challenging, because that's empathizing. What about if you're building on the argument, but you want to show that you followed it? Yes, you said this. Furthermore, or, it sounds like this is important to you. Additionally, or building on that idea and demonstrating that you understood what you were listening to. So what about if you're looking at the next part of your marking? We looked at the first two sections, and now we're thinking about how you respond effectively. So, empathizing. I can see why this is important to you. I understand this may be a concern for you. It sounds like you've put a lot of thought into this. I appreciate your perspective on this matter. So, responding effectively, somebody has given you some detailed questions or given you some feedback, and you're demonstrating that you empathise. And if you're acknowledging what they've said, well, thank you for raising that point, and don't forget to answer the question. I appreciate your thoughtful question. I understand your concern, and it's an important one. I hear what you're saying, and it's a valid perspective. So either empathising or acknowledging. And remember, answer the question, because that shows that you responded effectively. So what about if you want to express interest? That's an interesting view, and then answer the question. I'm intrigued by your argument, especially answer the question. And if you are creating an affirmative response, absolutely, and answer the question. Exactly, and respond. You're absolutely right, and don't leave it there, because you might use the phrase you said, and you might say, I don't know, but. And if you repeat or paraphrase the question to show that you understand what you've been asked, that's a really excellent way to demonstrate that you've responded effectively. So we've looked at the first three sections of the way that your discussion is being marked in terms of how do you respond in speaking and listening. And now, what about making requests and asking detailed and pertinent questions? What does that mean? Well, it means that you can act in one of these ways. Polite request. Could you please? I would appreciate it if you could. Would it be possible to? If it's not too much trouble, could you? Well, if I was in a discussion group, I probably would aim for could you please, or would it be possible to? Because the shortest that you make that request, it's going to be easier for the other people in the discussion to pick up on the ideas. So what about open-ended questions? Remember when I told you that a closed question is when you ask a question that somebody only has to answer yes or no to. And an open-ended question is a question that means they have to give you some information. So you could ask the types of questions. How do you envisage this? In what ways can we improve? What are your thoughts about that? Or, what else do you think we need to consider? So thinking about making requests and asking detailed questions, you're really asking yourself, am I doing open-ended questions? And specific questions. could be open-ended because you still want information. So you could ask for the key components of something, or can you specify, and then that might be the time frame or the information that you need. I'm really interested in the details of, can you just outline the steps that you talked about there when you mentioned? So think about these questions, but rephrase them in a way that you would naturally speak. Don't just throw these questions into your discussion, otherwise it'll sound really stilted. And what about confirming? Can you confirm that? And perhaps this one would be too awkward for you. Am I correct in understanding that? That would be quite awkward. How would you actually say that if you were using your own natural voice and conversation? Did I understand that correctly? Might be a question I might ask. Right, is it accurate to say that? So that might be questioning the person, thinking, well, I don't really think that all the facts are there. Have you got all the facts there? Where did you get your research from? So could you verify is quite a good one, because then you're looking at, as well as your opinion, have you used any facts or have you done any research to think about what you're telling us about? And you can always ask, could you explain? And if you're clarifying, could you clarify? I love that word, clarify, but only use it if you feel that you've practiced it and actually you quite like using it. Could you just clarify that? Sounds really natural. If you just say, could you clarify? It sounds a little bit clumsy and not very natural. So, can you provide more details about whatever it is you're listening to? And I wouldn't say, I'm not quite clear on, could you elaborate? I would use that as two separate things. And I would actually say, I'm not quite clear about. I wouldn't say on. Can you elaborate? I wouldn't say could. So you can see that even though these examples are here for you, it's really about you thinking about them and saying, how would I say that? Would you mind explaining? I wouldn't say that. Would you mind explaining? Because you're in a discussion for an exam. So I would say, please, can you explain? Or can you explain? Or could you explain? Could you explain? A much better phrase to continue with. Could you explain that noise that keeps happening? So when you're thinking about your speaking and listening, look at the phrases, but don't just learn them. Think about, how would I say that? And that's when you're really doing something really well at level 2. So what about the rest of the ways in which we look at speaking and listening and discussion, and we use the criteria from the exam board? Well, let's have a look. So the last set of ideas from the exam board, we're going to narrow it down again and look at communicating information, ideas and opinions. But really look at that section there in red, providing further detail and development if required. So remember, as part of your work, somebody's going to be asking you some questions. So are you ready for that? Do you know how you would answer questions? Think about it. But for when you're looking at this section of communicating, what about introducing ideas? You might say essentially. You could say the key point is, or the key points are. In other words, I really like in other words, because when you're using in other words, you're actually taking the idea and rephrasing it. And every time you rephrase, you are actually achieving, because you're demonstrating understanding, and that's brilliant. So maybe you could provide some examples by thinking about the language you use to do that. So for saying, for instance, as an example, such as, and then when I look at those ideas, I really think for me it sounds more natural to say for instance. It might not be the same for you, so think about, there might be something that's not there on those ideas that you use. So it's really just thinking about, introduce your examples. And don't forget to sequence, because obviously your information is not effective if you haven't put it in the right order. First and foremost, love that phrase, initially, to begin with, subsequently, following that, next, moving on to, in the second stage, consequently, and please do not say in conclusion. I've put it there to say to you, remember, we know you're going towards a conclusion, but you're level 2. Think about it. Consequently is a lovely way to conclude, but you might want to add something else after that. Do not say in conclusion in the same way that I say to you, don't write in conclusion. So, concluding your ideas. In summary, to sum up, in a nutshell, to wrap it up, to recap, ultimately to conclude, all in all, in the final analysis, to bring it all together. But I wouldn't use to conclude, it's the same as in conclusion. Don't use it. I wouldn't use in a nutshell unless you're talking informally. I wouldn't use to sum up unless you're talking informally. I love the word ultimately, and you could say in the final analysis or to bring it all together, but please remember, don't say in conclusion or to conclude. We don't need those phrases. So what's next? We've already looked at SCS5 about communicating, so now we need to look at expressing opinions. You're really good at expressing opinions, so let's have a look at some of the language. So if you're presenting an argument, first and foremost, to begin with, one key point is, another important factor is, moreover, furthermore, additionally, in addition to this, it's worth noting that a compelling argument for this is, love all of those phrases. Have a think about what works for you. And what about if you're encouraging agreement? You might be trying to persuade your listeners about something. You want to encourage them to agree. Oh, I'm sure you'll agree. Or I'm sure you'll agree that, and then say the ending. It's hard to dispute the fact that we can all appreciate that, and really think about your writing as well when you're doing speaking and listening. When you're including other people by using we, it's very inclusive. It really is directly talking to your audience, and I think that gives it a much better impact. Most people would concur that allows for the fact that someone in your audience might not. I think we can all see that. And I'm certain we can find common ground on the idea that, especially if you know that somebody else who's in your discussion group doesn't actually agree with you on that. And it's okay to disagree, but it's really, really good if you find a phrase to show that you're including other ideas. And that's encouraging agreement. So introducing your opinion. In my opinion, I believe that from my perspective, it seems to me that, as I see it, I'm convinced that, in my view, it's my contention that I'm of the opinion that it's clear to me that, and out of all of those, I really don't like in my opinion. We know it's your opinion because you're going to phrase something that tells us what you think. So really think about the language there. I love the word convinced. Are you really convinced? That's your opinion. Do you really, really believe in it? Because if you do, I'm convinced that. And what about acknowledging counter arguments? I really love this section of work for level 2 because it's really important to show that you're listening to the ideas of others. Well, while it's true that I understand that some may argue, well, it may be contended that admittedly, one might argue that, nevertheless, however, on the other hand, contrary to this viewpoint, it's important to consider the opposing perspective, and any of those ideas for acknowledging would be brilliant. So what about adding emphasis? Indeed, surely, truly, in fact, notably, clearly, importantly, emphatically, without question. It cannot be overstated that. So anything there, if it fits. And this is the key. If the phrase fits, use it. If the phrase doesn't fit, don't use it. But think about how you acknowledge, how you encourage, how you add emphasis, and how you present your argument and introduce your opinions. So, the last section then, we looked at all of the elements there, and we're thinking about the last section, which includes using language and making constructive contributions. So let's begin with using language that's effective, accurate and appropriate. Well, I can't tell if you're doing that unless I'm actually in the discussion listening to it, and I can tell you there's a more effective way to say that. So for this section, I'm going to just give some ideas that you might add to what you want to say. So adding emphasis. Indeed, surely, truly, in fact, notably, clearly, importantly, emphatically, without question, it cannot be overstated that. And most naturally for you might be without question or in fact. Yes? So you're presenting your argument. First and foremost, to begin with, one key point is, another important factor is, moreover, furthermore, additionally, in addition to this, it's worth noting that, and compelling argument for this is. So you're using effective language, but remember to use a starting point. And for you, it may be just identifying to begin with. So you're actually demonstrating that you know how to present an argument. And then what about providing evidence? Again, the same type of ideas that we've used when we're providing evidence for anything. But think about the language that you use when you talk. For example, as evidence, to illustrate, this is supported by, according to, research indicates that, a study conducted by Jane found that, in a survey, it was revealed that. This is substantiated by, the data shows that. And isn't that lovely that we end with data, because data is really kind of so important when you're thinking about presenting an argument, and are people going to actually agree with you? Do you have some ideas, something that you've looked up, perhaps a study or an article in a magazine, or some data, some information that you have, or a survey that you can use? It's quite important when you're thinking about providing evidence. So on that last section, we're really thinking about relevant and constructive. And I think if you've done just a little bit from each section that this video shows you, you will really be relevant and constructive. But if you want to seek involvement from other people, think about at the end, what are your thoughts on this? How do you see this fitting into our discussion? I probably wouldn't use, because it suggests you're off topic, and in an exam you're being marked for keeping on topic. I'd love to hear your perspective on I wouldn't use unless I was actually talking outside of an exam. Do you have any insights to add? You might use if nobody else is talking in the discussion. It gets a little bit difficult then. I wouldn't say, would you like to weigh in on this? It really sounds rather rude. But I could say, can I get your take on this matter? Very informal though. So really think about whether you're in a formal or informal situation. And some of the other comments that are suggested, I think we would really be looking at, what are your thoughts? Yes, there's that noise again. What are your thoughts about that? So, what are your thoughts? I don't always say on this. I say, what are your thoughts about that? So be quite emphatic about that last section of your question. And if you're moving on to a new topic, you might say, speaking of which, on a related note, that reminds me, moving on to another aspect, let's shift our focus, now turning to a different point. But before we get too far, let's explore another angle, changing gears a bit before we move on. But you know, if you're actually having a discussion, those ideas are quite good. But if you're doing a discussion for an exam, you need to maintain the same topic, but it may be that somebody has gone off on what we call a tangent, that it's about the ideas but not totally. So perhaps that when you talk about let's explore another angle is quite a good phrase. So finally for this then, building on ideas. Right, so this is the most important thing about discussion. It's a discussion when you give your view, you talk together about something, you're all talking about the same topic, and you build on the ideas of others, and that's when you're really achieving. So think about expanding other people's thoughts. So I wouldn't use the first phrase, but I would do it in terms of action. So I'd think about what somebody else said and try to expand or explore that a little bit. And I might say, building on that idea, or I might say, oh, yes, let's delve into, but I wouldn't use all of those phrases that are identified there. Oh, we've touched on that. I would probably use that phrase in that way. So taking it a step further, I really like that phrase. That's a good one to use. So when we say let's elaborate on that point, I would probably use elaborate when I'm talking about something I want to add perhaps. Can I elaborate on that, or can you elaborate on that if I want to know a little bit more information? So be very careful about the phrasing in this section of building on ideas. So diving deeper, that's not a phrase I use, but I might use the word examine. We need to examine, or we could examine, or let's examine. And now that we've covered that, what about? So I wouldn't say let's touch on, or let's also touch on. I would say now that we've covered that, what about? And before we move on, I don't use the word completely. Before we move on, what about? I don't say let's also talk about. Before we move on, what about? So these phrases and ideas are there to get you to think about how you develop your discussion. They're not necessarily the words that you say. So you could see in the way that I talk through there that I wouldn't use all of these phrases, and I would use keywords and move that on in that way. So that's what's important for you for speaking and listening.